Hello everyone and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth and in today's video I will be ranking Jane Austen's 6 major novels. So I'm only going to be ranking the 6 major novels, none of the juvenilia, none of the unpublished, unfinished manuscripts, just the 6 big ones that we all know and love. I love watching these videos because I think it's really interesting to see how people rank Jane Austen. You really get a sense of people's taste as a reader by how they rank Jane Austen, because each one of her books was so different in terms of character and plot and structure. So grab your favorite beverage as we discuss Jane Austen. At number 6 is Sense and Sensibility, and already I feel like I'm starting out with a very unpopular choice here by ranking Sense and Sensibility so low. I think a lot of people consider this one of Jane Austen's top 3. For me, not so much. And maybe the reason for that is because I didn't read this book for the first time until last year. I had seen the movie with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet for years. I love that movie. It's one of my favorite adaptations of Jane Austen. I could watch that movie anytime. So when I actually read the book, I thought it was beautiful. I thought the language was elegant. The plot was fantastic, as always. However, I just was kind of like, because I did not realize that Eleanor especially was so young. In the movie, she comes across as at least being in her mid-20s. I think Emma Thompson was clearly in her 30s in that movie, maybe even in her 40s. But Eleanor is only 19 in this book, and for that reason, I just can't get behind her. She just seems so mature, so sophisticated. She's even more mature than the mother. She just seems like a little old lady in this book, and she's just so reserved. She's so shy, and not my favorite Jane Austen character by any stretch of the imagination. The same can be said for Mary Ann as well. I thought in the movie that Kate Winslet just kind of played her over the top on purpose, but in the book she's even crazier in the book than she is in the movie. She's just so whiny and crybaby. She swoons all the time. She's always in bed sick about something, and I know that Jane Austen was kind of poking fun at the sensationalist novels of her day, of women swooning all the time, the sentimentality. It just doesn't really wear well in the modern era. I think as modern women, we just don't get this book as much as we get other Jane Austen novels. So not a huge fan of Eleanor and Mary Ann. I think together they represent a really interesting character, like someone like Elizabeth Bennet, but separate, they just don't feel like complete characters to me. However, I do like some of the secondary characters in this book. In fact, I said it before last year that I really like Sir John Middleton. I think Sir John Middleton is one of my favorite characters in all of Jane Austen, one of my favorite side characters. I really love how he just finds a home for the Dashwood family, how he's always talking them up in society and telling everyone how charming and pretty and smart and talented the Dashwood sisters are. So I love Sir John Middleton. I really enjoy people like that just bring out the best in you, and they see the best in you when you can't even see it in yourself. For that same reason, I also really like Mrs. Jennings. I really like when she invites the girls to London and gives them that opportunity to kind of get away for a while, to meet other people, interact with society. And she just is there for the sisters in their triumphs and in their sorrows. So really love the secondary characters in this book. But the main character is just not a fan. I really find Edward to be kind of a wimp in this book. I mean, he just won't make a decision because Eleanor has no money. Also, Colonel Brandon, right? I really find the romance between Colonel Brandon and Mary Ann just to be very disingenuous. I really think that is one of the most disappointing romances in all of literature. They make Jo March and Professor Bhaer seem like madly in love with each other. They make that romance seem so romantic and passionate compared to Mary Ann and Colonel Brandon. I just don't buy it. I don't like it, especially since Mary Ann is only 17. I mean, the girl was dumped, for God's sakes. Doesn't mean she needed to go out and marry the first guy that came around and rescued her. So that, I think Jane Austen is subtly kind of giving us a wink on that. So I don't know how other people interpret that, but Yeah, that's how I interpret it. In fact, it seems like money is the most important thing in this book. It's just mentioned constantly. It's hinted at in other of Jane Austen's novels. So I think in Pride and Prejudice, that's why Mrs. Bennet is so obsessed with getting all the girls married, because she knows Mr. Collins is going to kick them out of their house. And in Sense and Sensibility, you see what happens when you're kicked out of your house as a woman. I mean, they had no property rights, no inheritance rights. And so maybe that's why Marianne is just so frustrated and crying and throwing temper tantrums all the time, because she knows she has no rights, so that there's nothing she can do except marry a wealthy guy. So if they had never called this book Sense and Sensibility, they could have named it after that TV show, Two Broke Girls, because that's what this book is. It's about two really pretty, really smart, talented women that have no options because they're poor. And I do love this one. Of course, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but yeah, it's just not my favorite Jane Austen. At number 5 is Persuasion by Jane Austen. I've mentioned several times that I am rereading this for Jane Austen July, and I thought that I would bump up Persuasion by reading it again, but no, it's still kind of flatlining at the number 5 spot, just because, yeah, just not my favorite Jane Austen. I don't really love this story as much as other people do, and I'm quite surprised because a lot of my favorite booktubers rank this as their favorite Jane Austen, and I can understand that because I do think it is one of the most romantic of all of the Jane Austen novels. So if you like the romance in Jane Austen, this one is certainly full of romance. But I'm just not a huge fan of Captain Wentworth in particular. That's why I rank this one so low. Captain Wentworth is by far my least favorite hero in all of Jane Austen. I just think he is so mean to Anne at the beginning of this book. He's so bitter and just very unkind. I mean, let's just go ahead and flirt with a bunch of girls right in front of our ex-fiance. That's kind of cold, baby. That's cold. So that being said, every time I read this book, I like Anne Elliot just a little more. I think she is such a wonderful character, so sweet, so kind, definitely Jane Austen's most mature character. And I don't like the implication that she was an old maid at 27. So every time I read this book, I'm like, thank God I live in the 21st century. I would have killed myself if I lived back then. You feel some sympathy with Jane Austen and what she was going through. I think she reveals a lot about her own personal life through the character of Anne Elliot. That is for sure. Also, I'm not a huge fan of all the secondary characters in this book. Her father and her sisters are extremely annoying, especially her sister Mary. Oh, every time Mary starts talking, I'm like, oh my God. And the Musgroves, they're not that interesting. Lady Russell, I do like Lady Russell. I don't consider Lady Russell to be a villain for telling Anne to just kind of weigh her options at 19. Oh, sorry, she was only 19. But yeah, the character that I do like in this book a lot is a very, very minor character, and her name is Mrs. Smith, and she's one of Anne's old girlfriends, one of her old school friends, and she's fallen on a hard time. She's poor, she's a widow, she's seen some realities of life, but yet she's still very kind and loving, and she just has a good view on life. So those chapters where she goes to visit Mrs. Smith, I think, are some of my favorite chapters. But altogether, these characters are extremely self-centered, very spoiled, very selfish. And every time I read this, I just want Anne Elliot to just tell everyone to go to hell, to go to London and start her own business and go back to law school. Every time I read this, she does not need Captain Wentworth. She does not need him at all. Also, I think all the drama in this book could have been avoided if they had actually just sat down at the beginning and talked to each other or had it out with each other. They never really have a fight, which is, I'm always waiting for them to kind of have a fight, and they never do. But if they had just sat down at the beginning and shared a bottle of wine, I think this whole book could have been avoided. They could have got together much sooner. Also, there never really has been a great adaptation of Persuasion. That might be a reason I don't like it as much as other Austen novels. But yeah, I've heard that Netflix is coming out with a new adaptation next year. I'm crossing my fingers that I'll like that one. At number 4 is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This book is absolutely delightful. In fact, when I read this for the first time several years ago, I just immediately solidified for me that Jane Austen was a genius, because this is her lightest book. She's at her wittiest, her most satirical, her most charming, but yet she doesn't sacrifice on language and elegance and plot structure and characters. She just cannot not be good, basically. And I heard that this was her first book that she wrote, but the last book that she got published. And that is very obvious to me because this book almost feels like Jane Austen YA. Catherine Morland is definitely the youngest and the most naive of all of Austen's heroines, maybe along with Marianne Dashwood. But I really like this one, how she goes into society in Bath and she just kind of experiences life and people for the first time. We've all been there. All young people have been there. You move to New York for the first time to a new city. People don't always act how you want them to act. You kind of make friends, you lose friends. You know the deal. But I really love all the characters in this book, especially Isabella. I know Isabella is the villain in this book, but I am one of those people that love her. I think she is one of the best characters in all of Austen. So funny, so cute, and I don't blame her for weighing her options. As we saw with the Dashwood sisters, women at this time had nothing but their looks to go on, and the fact that Isabella uses that, you know, I cannot fault her for that. I really like her character a lot. And one other character that I love from this book so much is Mr. Tilney. In fact, if Captain Wentworth is my least favorite Austen hero, Mr. Tilney is definitely my favorite Austen hero. I just find him to be absolutely delightful, very witty, very charming, very good looking, and I am a little intimidated. I don't know about you, I'm intimidated by Mr. Darcy and Mr. Knightley. I would not want to meet them. I would be all like, if I ever met them. Where Mr. Tilney, I would have no problem sitting next to him at a dinner party and just swapping stories over a glass of wine. I think he would be so much fun to talk to. In fact, as a modern reader, I almost read Mr. Tilney as being a gay character. So I don't want to offend anyone, but he just seems a little too witty, a little too good looking, a little too debonair to be straight to me. He almost feels like a character from Oscar Wilde. I really love him so much, and it makes me think that maybe there are some LGBTQ characters in Jane Austen. Maybe she didn't intend it, but as a modern reader, you just can't help picking up on some of those themes in Jane Austen, especially when it comes to Mr. Tilney or a character like Frank Churchill, or even someone like Mary Bennet or Charlotte Lucas. There's definitely some themes there. But moving on, one reason that I just don't buy him as being a very romantic hero is that the romance between him and Catherine doesn't feel very passionate to me. It just feels very like they're very good friends. In fact, he mainly teaches her to grow up in this book, which is why I like it so much. And she basically accuses his father of being a murderer, and he still likes her. So this is a fantastic book. It's all about just learning to grow up, to stop imagining things, stop letting your imagination run away with you. Really one of my favorite Jane Austens, and such a treat if you have not read it. In terms of adaptations, I think this one also has one of the best adaptations, starring Carey Mulligan as Isabella. She just nails it. And also Felicity Jones as Catherine from Rogue One from Star Wars. That movie is absolutely delightful. It pushes the envelope a little bit, just slightly, but it is so much fun. My third favorite Jane Austen novel is probably what I consider to be her best novel, her masterpiece. And a lot of you might be thinking, okay, if this is her masterpiece, you're going to talk about why are you ranking it at number 3? And that's because it's not my favorite. It really isn't. I think it's her best novel, but it is not my favorite. And that is Emma by Jane Austen. I do love this one so much. I think this is just Jane Austen at her best. I really, really do. She just seemed to be aware of her own power at this point. She had already published Pride and Prejudice, and she was even negotiating on this book, I believe, in London. And you just see all of her best traits as a writer on display in this book. Her wit, her sense of humor, her amazing characters, Mr. Elton and Harriet and the father and Mrs. Weston and Frank Churchill. Just such amazing characters. And I do think there is a reason that this is the darling of Hollywood, because it's witty, it's funny, but it's also extremely romantic at the same time. We have 2 really sweet romances going on at once, maybe even 3, maybe even 4. So it's very romantic as well, and just a lot of fun. And I've never seen a bad adaptation of this. I haven't seen the new one, but I do love the BBC miniseries based on this book. I also really like the Gwyneth Paltrow 90s movie. I know a lot of people don't like that one, but I think that one is really cool with her and Toni Collette. I even like the Kate Beckinsale one. I love Clueless. This one, there's just a lot to sink your teeth into with Emma. I also recommend this one as a good place to start with Jane Austen. If you're just completely new to Jane Austen, you want to read one of her books, start with Emma, simply because there are all of those adaptations. So you can read it, you can watch the movie, see how the story is supposed to develop. I also think this is a good one for book clubs. So if you're one of those people that just really wants to read Jane Austen with your book club and have everyone discuss a Jane Austen novel, I think this is the easiest one to discuss. There's so many themes going on in this book. And in fact, I did read this one in college. This was the only Jane Austen I ever read in a school setting. And it was really good. It was a lot of fun for all of us girls in that class to kind of see what the guys thought about the book. And they came up with some really interesting observations. So if you have like a father or a brother or a boyfriend that you really want to get to read Jane Austen, I recommend that you try Emma, because I think guys will have a good interpretation of Emma. If you are looking for some nice editions of a Jane Austen novel, I would recommend these Marjolaine Baston illustrated editions. They're very delicate, very beautiful. They have illustrations of birds and flowers and butterflies, and then tucked throughout the pages are letters and dance cards and recipes and newspaper clipping. And I think there's even a riddle that Emma and Harry are working on to entice Mr. Elton. So this is such a beautiful edition. I'll show you some close-up shots if you'd like to see this. Very popular edition and very beautiful in person. And I think this is a nice way to start collecting Jane Austen if you're looking for some nicer Jane Austen books. Alrighty, for my number 2 Jane Austen pick, I'm going to go with an unpopular answer, and that is Mansfield Park. In fact, if it wasn't for number 1, this would be my favorite Jane Austen novel. I absolutely love this book. I just feel that people do not get Mansfield Park. They don't get Fanny Price. This is really one of her most refined, one of her most elegant, and I certainly believe it's her best written book. I think the writing in this is just sublime. Jane Austen's observations about people and human nature, just the elegance of her language is unparalleled in this book. If you're unfamiliar with this book, it is about a young woman named Fanny Price, and she starts off poor and she is sent to live with her wealthier relations, and she is introduced to all of the good things in life, like good company, good food, education, but she's never really one of the family. She's just not at the same level or treated in the same way as her cousins, especially her girl cousins. And at the same time, she's falling in love with her boy cousin, Edmund. And, you know, I think that might be why a lot of people don't like this book, is that she's in love with her cousin. And by today's standards, it's a little like, ew. But obviously in Jane Austen's time, that was pretty standard. I think if you've seen Downton Abbey, I think you're kind of understanding the whole why people marry their cousin situation. So once you can get past that, it really is a sweet romance. But one of my favorite reasons that I like this book is I really do like the character of Fanny Price. I think she is one of Jane Austen's best heroines, and she is very shy and she's very introverted. So I just said that I really didn't like Eleanor. I didn't really love Anne Elliot because they were so shy and introverted. But I don't know, I think the reason I like Fanny Price is she doesn't strike me as someone that would necessarily be shy and introverted if she wasn't in the situation that she was in. So I feel like there is kind of something in her that could be released if she was given more freedom. I think there is a little bit of a Lizzie Bennet in her, or an Anne Elliot in her, if she just had more choice, more power. But because she has no choice, I mean, her only choices are just to shut up, hang out, go with the flow with her cousins, or go back to her family, which are very poor and very uncouth. And so I think the most interesting part of this book is when she goes back to her family and she just does not fit in. It almost reminds me, if anyone has seen the movie Sabrina with Audrey Hepburn, when the father says, you know, she doesn't belong in a mansion, but she doesn't belong over the garage. And I feel exactly the same way about Fanny Price as I do about Sabrina Fairchild. That she's just such a unique person. There's no place that she really fits in. And because I love Jane Eyre so much, I think that's why I like Fanny Price. This book is kind of the closest to Charlotte Bronte of any of Jane Austen's novels, and Jane Eyre and Fanny Price are very similar. Jane Eyre is a little more passionate, a little more, pushes the envelope than Fanny Price, but they both have very strong morals and standards for themselves. They have a real sense of their own individuality. Fanny Price does something really amazing in this book, which tells me that she is not a wimp at all. And so if anyone finds her to be a wimpy character, maybe you haven't read those chapters, because she does something amazing. She really stands up for herself. She stands up for her morals, for her values, even when everyone else in her life is telling her to do the exact opposite. She has all this pressure on her. She stays true to herself, and that is why I love her so much as a character. She is so amazing. In fact, when you read this book, it almost feels like Fanny is the only sane person in this entire book, maybe her brother too. But Fanny alone is just the center of this book, whereas everyone else around her is a little bit crazy. So it's just interesting watching her interact with all of the characters in this book. I also really love Henry and Mary Crawford. I think they add just a certain element to this book. They make it a lot more interesting, a lot more exciting, of course. And yeah, I just love when those characters come into the book and they stage that whole play. And everyone's flirting with each other. Just a lot of fun. So even though this is Jane Austen's one of her most sedate novels, still go back and read it. I still think there's a lot in this book that you just can't find in books like Emma, Pride and Prejudice, or Persuasion. There's something really special about Mansfield Park, and I really love this book a lot. One reason I suspect that a lot of people don't like this is because they've never made a really good adaptation of Mansfield Park. The 90s movie is absolutely horrific. It's terrible. I cannot stand that movie. If anyone is a Jane Austen fan, you know how bad that movie is. I think the BBC made a version. It wasn't great. And so a lot of people question whether Mansfield Park can ever be adapted to a movie. And I think it's one of those situations where this book is good because the writing is so good. So sometimes you just cannot adapt excellent writing into cinema or theater. Sometimes it just doesn't work that way. So for that reason, I still love this book. It is my number 2 pick, and I absolutely love Fanny Price. At number 1, you guessed it, is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I don't understand how anyone could not rank this number 1. It just, in my opinion, is Jane Austen's best novel. As I said, Emma is probably better written, probably a little more interesting, probably a lot more to discuss with Emma. Pride and Prejudice is just my favorite, just hands down. I loved this book as a teenager. I just reread it probably every few years, maybe every 2 to 3 years. I try to reread Pride and Prejudice, and it does seem like every time I reread it, I just appreciate it even more. And that just brings up a point about Jane Austen. You just can keep rereading her books throughout your life, and they just have more depth, more meaning, and that's why she is such a fantastic writer. But why do I love this book so much? Because not only is it a great book, but it's one of the best romances of all time. And as someone that's not super romantic, the reason I like this book so much is because it's not all about the girl character. It's a lot about Fitzwilliam Darcy as well. In fact, I think the character development of Fitzwilliam Darcy is just maybe a little more interesting than even Elizabeth Bennet. I think Elizabeth Bennet is one of the best characters in all of literature. Her personality, her wit, her charm. I just want to be Elizabeth Bennet. But I really like the character development of Mr. Darcy. He just isn't this stick figure, this stand-in, like so many YA and romance novels that we read today. He's a really well-developed character, and a very flawed character as well. Both he and Elizabeth are flawed. They are both Pride and Prejudiced. They both have a lot of faults. They both jump to conclusions about people. But that's the best thing about this book, is that they both change. They both learn how to become better people in the process of falling in love. And I think that's why I love this book so much, because I think that Elizabeth and Fitzwilliam Darcy are perfect as a couple, but more importantly, they're just good people individually too. I could read a book just all about Elizabeth Bennet. I could read a book all about Mr. Darcy. So the fact that they come together in this book and they fall in love with each other and they learn to appreciate each other is why I love this one so much. I also really like the adaptations for Pride and Prejudice, both the 90s version and the newer Keira Knightley version. The 90s version with Colin Firth is a classic. Now, is it just me, but does Jane look like Mona Lisa in that movie? Right? She kind of looks like Mona Lisa to me. But anyways, I really love when Colin Firth, comes out of the pond. I think even Jane Austen would have approved of the wet shirt situation. I also really like the Keira Knightley version. I think that one's so beautiful, the way they shot that, the cinematography of her standing on the cliff. I also really like how you can really get a sense that the Bennets were not super wealthy, that they were gentility, but not wealthy. And so I like when Elizabeth is just kind of hanging out in the yard with all the chickens and the pigs and the cows. Really like that one a lot. I think some people can be very cynical about Pride and Prejudice and say, you know, look, Jane Austen herself died an old maid. This is just pure fantasy. Real life romance is not like this. People get divorced, marriage is hard, yada, yada, yada. But I think the reason this book is so special is that Jane Austen set a standard that if we all can't reach, we all should certainly try to aspire to at least. And that is that every person deserves someone that gets them, that understands them, that appreciates them for all their strengths, but most importantly, for all of their faults. And I think no matter who you are, young, old, rich, poor, gay, straight, you deserve that. You deserve to find your Mr. Darcy or your Elizabeth Bennet. And even if you don't get it, like Jane Austen, it's important to strive for. So, and we don't know. We don't know if Jane Austen didn't have a romance like Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. If she was able to write this, I kind of think she might have. She might have understood those feelings, because otherwise she wouldn't have been able to write them so well. That being said, I love this book so much. This particular edition is the new version with the letters by Chronicle Books. It is curated by Barbara Heller. Very cool edition. So what it is, it's Pride and Prejudice, and then each of the letters are tucked into the book, so you can read all of the invitations to Netherfield. You can read all the correspondence between Elizabeth and Jane. And then, of course, you can read that infamous letter that Mr. Darcy gives Elizabeth. So I really enjoy this edition, and I will show you some more close-up shots. But yeah, love Pride and Prejudice. I think this is really one of the best books of all time. So thank you everyone for joining me for my Jane Austen ranking. As you can see, I'm very passionate about all these books. I have a lot of theories about all these books, and Jane Austen, she just, as I said before, you can reread her multiple times and still discover so many layers to these novels. She was such a genius, and I think she was just ahead of her time. I think that's why we, 200 years later, are still talking about her, because she was such a fantastic writer, and each one of these books is amazing. So thank you everyone, and have a terrific day.